Welcome into the first ever Cheap Seats NHL Power Rankings. Something at least I don't think I've ever done before, and if I have ever done it, it's been quite a while, and it's something that I plan to do at least semi-weekly going on here into the future. How often I do it will depend somewhat on whether or not the Kraken play on Sundays, as I do plan to do it Sunday night going into the new week, because it's usually a day that's pretty light on the NHL calendar because they try to avoid competing with the NFL too much. But we'll probably do it Sunday nights, and again, if the Kraken play, it might be hard to get it done that week. Otherwise, I'm going to do it as many weeks as possible. And to be perfectly honest, I'll make an effort to do these even every week if they turn out to be popular enough, which is ultimately up to you guys watching this video. So, as always, there are buttons down below that let me know whether or not you want more of this. And it's also probably worth mentioning, with this being the first time I'm doing this, that I'm not going to be doing all 32 teams. I don't really want the video to be that long, and I just don't have the time for that the way things stand right now, so I'm going to be sticking to top 10s every week, with maybe some honorable mentions thrown in. With that being said, let's get right into it, and a couple of honorable mentions I have here that didn't quite make the top 10, but are certainly on that bubble if things go well for them here in the next week. One would be the Vancouver Canucks, who, quite honestly, I still don't know if I'm a believer in this team, and I think a lot of Canucks fans probably fall into that category as well, because, well, things did get off to a pretty strong start with those two first games against Edmonton. It's been a little bit more of a rocky road since then, as I think most people probably saw coming with this team. That having been said, it is definitely worth mentioning that Besser, thanks in large part to those 4 goals in the first game, still is in a 4-way tie for second most goals in the NHL. Pettersson's in a 2-way tie for second most points, and Demko's been pretty good to the start of this season so far, and especially that third one is something that was one of the bigger question marks coming into the season, and if Demko can keep playing the way he is, and Pettersson for that matter as well, this is a team that has a good chance at making the playoffs. Again, at least for now though, the confidence, at least for me, isn't quite there to get them into the top 10, but it has at least been a decent start to the season for Vancouver. And finally, one more honorable mention before we get into the top 10. I also have, for similar reasons to Vancouver, though maybe even more to the extremes, the Philadelphia Flyers, because while the Flyers certainly have gotten off to a top 10 start to the season as far as the standings are concerned, this is still not a roster that I have a lot of confidence in staying anywhere near the top 10 as this season goes along. It does kind of seem like something that's just a hot start and a small sample size, but if it continues, I'm open to moving them up. I'm just not terribly convinced that that's going to happen. Actually, sorry, one more before, and then I promise we'll get to the top 10. But I do want to mention that I had the Carolina Hurricanes actually top 3 coming into the season, but they've fallen all the way out of the top 10, mostly because, well, quite honestly, they're just giving up goals at an absolutely absurd rate, having already given up 30 in 6 games, which is 6 more than any other team has given up to this point. And look, if they do manage to get back to being the strong defensive team, especially that they were last season, then I have no doubt that they'll be back into the top 10, probably even top 5 in fairly short order. But until then, it's going to be hard to go too far giving up 5 goals per game. So then as we do finally get into it, starting things off in 10th place, I have the LA Kings. Now, this is a pretty tenuous 10th place for the Kings, whose 2-2-1 record is not terribly impressive, and I think a lot of people would question how that's even a top 10 power ranking type of record. Part of that is because it's been a pretty middling start to the season for a lot of teams, and while there are a handful of teams that are just above the Kings with technically winning records, like either the Canucks or Flyers, I still believe in the construction of the Kings roster more than a lot of those teams. Certainly enough that the small gap of 1 or 2 points between the Kings and those teams is not enough for me to bump the Kings down, especially when the biggest question mark that myself and I think a lot of people had about this Kings roster coming into the season was about their goaltending, which actually has been pretty decent at this point. Talbot has not been bad, and while Copley did have 1 start and it did not go very well, he's only had the 1 start, so as long as Talbot continues to play the way he is and stays healthy, then the Kings should be perfectly fine. And I did give them a little bit of a pass because their 2 regulation losses have been to the Avalanche and Bruins, neither of which has lost a game yet this season. So I feel like that 2-2-1 record is actually a much better 2-2-1 than say, some other teams that could be around that same area. Up next in 9th place, I have the Ottawa Senators. And yes, I'm sure that some Canes fans are now noticing that the teams I have in both 9th and 10th, they managed to beat both of them. But again, I've already mentioned why the Canes aren't on this list, and I still do expect them to be back before too much longer. But at least when it comes to the Senators, it's been a pretty decent start to the season. One where there's a lot of expectations coming into it from the fan base, with this core that, while it is still young, does need to start getting things turned around and at least getting close to the playoffs, if not making them. And as far as that's concerned, it's been a pretty decent start. I mean, yeah, Korpisalo's had a bit of a tough start to the season, but fortunately Forsberg's been pretty good as a 1B option, and who knows, maybe that'll turn into more of a 1A if things keep going the way for Korpisalo that they have. And at least in front of them, they've been scoring at a pretty good rate, 4th in the NHL in goals per game to this point, just behind the LA Kings and a couple of others. And yes, Canes fans, one of those other two is the Hurricanes, but again, they're giving up goals at an even faster rate, hence why they're not in the top 10 at this point. Anyway, for the Senators, this has been a pretty steady start to the season, actually pretty well-rounded start. There's not any one particular player that's been carrying them to this point, so getting production up and down their lineup, which is always good, and pretty complementary defense and offense for this team, which is a recipe for success as long as they can keep it going. Up next in the 8th spot, I have another one of these teams that, had I done this last week or at the beginning of the season, probably would have been higher on this list. And while I still believe that the Maple Leafs have one of the better constructed rosters, and they did have a pretty good start to the season, 13 goals in 2 games, sure, they needed overtime to beat the Habs, which brings up the question of goaltending, or at least Samsonov anyway. Wolves actually had a pretty good start. And obviously the back-to-back hat tricks for Matthews. They followed those two up with the 4-1 loss to the Blackhawks, and then a 3-1 loss to a Panthers team that also will probably find its footing, but has been having a bit of a rocky start to their season as well. Fortunately for the Leafs, though, they did bounce back with that 4-3 win in overtime against Tampa Bay on Saturday, which very well may have kept them in the top 10. I might have put them out had they lost that and continued the slide. Hard to say. They do end up winning it. Nyes looked good in that game, which that would be good for Toronto if he can really get going. And I don't know if it's worrying, but it's probably worth mentioning that after those back-to-back hat tricks, Matthews has yet to put another one in the net. I'm sure he'll get going again, but it probably just puts a little bit of a damper on the hopes for a 65-70 goal season from him. Obviously, as always, there's going to be the questions in Leafland about the defense and consistency in goaltending, especially the closer we get to the playoffs. But ultimately, that's what they're waiting for, is to see what happens once the postseason rolls around, which I have no doubt in my mind they'll end up making unless something catastrophic happens. And I would also be somewhat surprised if they spend much of the season outside the top 10. In 7th, I have the New Jersey Devils, another team that could very well find their way moving up this list as time goes along. But part of it is because we just haven't seen a lot of this team so far, at least not as much as some other teams, having only played 4 games, and it hasn't necessarily been a gangbusters start to the season. A 2-1-1 record, so still respectable, but again, not too far from kind of that middle pack of teams. It does help that they are the one team that's beat the Detroit Red Wings, who we still have yet to get to on this list. But another thing the Devils have going for them is that if Jack Hughes can keep playing the way that he is, they're going to have no trouble moving their way up this list as they get more games under their belt, as Hughes, even in spite of having played only 4 games, is still tied for 2nd place in the league with 10 points, along with Elias Pettersson. And although that is now behind DeBrincat as of Sunday night, it does still lead the league in points per game. At least for me then, the only real question I have about the Devils, based on early returns, would be their ability to keep the puck out of their own net, because, well, offensively, things are pretty much picking up where they left off last season. Defensively and goaltending, well, both of those are either average or below average to this point, which is not to say that they've been bad there necessarily, but as far as a top 10 type of team is concerned, it is at least something to keep an eye on as we get farther into the start of the season. In 6th place, I have the New York Rangers, who so far have been pretty much as advertised. They're getting the scoring from where you'd expect it to come from. Panarin has 3, Kreider has 4, Zibanejad and Fox are picking up assists consistently, and heck, even Lafreniere has put in 2, which in a bit of a prove-it season for the young forward following a slow start to his career after being picked 1st overall is a good sign for his future, at least to this point anyway. Plus, you're still getting the violence in the back end with the bordering on questionable hits on a consistent basis from Trouba as usual. Really, the only questions to this point for the Rangers would be, one, they haven't really played a top-tier opponent to this point. There's a couple of teams that certainly everyone thought were going to be better coming into the season that so far have gotten off to pretty bad starts. The team I cheer for being one of those, along with the Sabres. And maybe there's something to be said about consistency for the Rangers, because so far they've alternated wins and losses in that easier schedule that they've had, at least based on how teams have been playing to this point. And yeah, there might be also a little bit of concern that Shesterkin's gotten off to a shaky start and weirdly Quick looked better in the one game he played than Shesterkin in the 4 he did. But I wouldn't expect that to continue to be true as the season goes along. Again, probably just a small sample size at the start of the season. But for the Rangers, no real reason to believe that they aren't a top 10 team to this point. As we move then into the top 5, I do think it's worth mentioning that there's already a bit of a gap opening up here between these top 5 teams and the rest of the league. Still early enough that it's not a gap that couldn't be overcome in the space of a week, at least for a couple of the teams anyway, if a team below them got hot and they fell apart. But at least to me anyway, these top 5 teams are clearly the top 5, even if you might disagree with the order. And I'm sure some people in Detroit probably will disagree with the order, because in 5th place, I do have the red hot Red Wings, who are now on a 5-game winning streak after having dispatched the Flames on Sunday night. And for the Red Wings, especially offensively, it has been a very strong start to the season, as they currently lead the NHL in goals for per game with 4.8. They are easily the best power play in the NHL, scoring 50% of the time with 9 power play goals already, which is obviously something that will come down as the season goes along, but still a very strong start for them there. And even defensively, when it comes to goals against per game, they're a top 10 team there as well, in 9th place. Now, it is true that a large part of that hot offensive start has pretty much come from 2 players for the Red Wings, in Dylan Larkin and Alex DeBrincat, with Larkin's 8 assists along with 3 goals, tying him for the most assists so far to this point with Elias Pettersson. And to clear up something that I said earlier, I didn't realize that Larkin had actually passed the 10 points of Pettersson and Jack Hughes, so those two are actually tied for 3rd, not 2nd like I said earlier. But that does put Larkin in 2nd place to only Alex DeBrincat, whose 8 goals along with 4 assists, well, the 8 goals lead the NHL by 2, and those 4 assists to get 12 points also leads the NHL at this point. So, you know, when those 2 guys eventually do slow down, which you'd have to imagine that they certainly will, maybe that will spell a little bit of a slowdown for the Red Wings as well. But at least for now, it is a very hot start to the season for those 2, and this Red Wings team is off to a strong start in a season where I think a lot of people were going to be watching to see how things went after a slower turnaround to this rebuild that Yzerman is going than a lot of people were expecting. Not that I'm sure any Red Wings fans ever doubted Yzerman, but it was taking a little bit longer than I think some people were expecting. Either way, if this continues, then that will be forgotten in the past. Then in 4th place, as we do now get into the teams that have yet to lose in regulation, I have the Dallas Stars, whose only loss is a shootout loss to the undefeated Golden Knights. They're really the only team that have given the Golden Knights much of a test to this point in the season, which I think is something to be said about the Stars in its own right. And yeah, they did need shootout or overtime to beat the Blues at the start and the Flyers most recently, but they still did end up getting those wins. And really, the only question about the Stars' start to the season is that offensively, it hasn't been the hottest start ever. Certainly, Jason Robertson has been pretty slow starting to this point in the season with just 2 assists and no goals so far. But you'd have to imagine he'd get that turned around. And while the offense has been taking some time to warm up, they've at least been able to get along just fine with strong defense and a good start from Ottinger. Not to mention the fact that their penalty kill is the only one still perfect in the NHL to this point in the season. So for the Stars, if they can continue to be this good at keeping the puck out of their own net long enough to get the offense going, this will be indeed a very hard team to beat as the rest of this season goes along. And then there's the top three, all three of which are still truly undefeated to this point in the season, having played 5 to 6 games each. And honestly, it's kind of just splitting hairs to pick which one goes in which spot. But in the third spot, I do have the Boston Bruins. Now, for the Bruins, coming into the season, the question was how much worse this team was going to be, with the clear expectation that they weren't going to tie or set a new NHL record for wins in a season, so some amount of getting worse was bound to happen, but just how much worse was the question, especially considering that there were some, I think, pretty fair questions about the moves that were made in the offseason, and a roster that looked a lot worse to some people coming out of the offseason than it did going in. Obviously, the retirement of Bergeron certainly didn't help anything in that regard. Either way, the early returns from the season are that this team might not have gotten all that much worse, as they're still a perfect 5-0. Now, there's something to be said about the fact that their schedule so far has not been terribly difficult, but again, you can only play the teams that you're given, and as for how the Bruins managed to win last year, it had a lot to do with their top-level defense and Vezina-style goaltending from both of their goaltenders. Both of those things have stayed true to this point, as the Bruins are, at this point in the season, leading the NHL in goals against per game. Giving up the fewest, that is. Then in second place, which will give first place away by process of elimination, but in second place, I have the Colorado Avalanche, who have had, at least in my opinion, a slightly harder schedule than the Bruins have to this point. They've at least played 3 playoff teams from last year already, including the team that knocked them out of the playoffs, even if that team has not gone off to a very good start this season. Again, that aside, the Avalanche have taken care of without too much trouble the schedule that's been put in front of them. And that has been due in large part to what has been, even if it's just been 5 games, a Vezina-style start to the season from Georgiev in net, who is, based on wherever you look, either the best goaltender in the NHL in the early part of this season, or second best, with Binnington usually being right there, as well as Ullmark for the Bruins. And for that matter, Swayman as well in Boston. But either way, Georgiev tops pretty much any list, no matter where you look at when it comes to goaltending, including, for example, money pucks, goals saved above expected, where Georgiev is by far and away in first, with 9.4 goals already saved above expected, which is well clear of 5 above expected, saved by Binnington in second place. And if that can continue for Georgiev on top of that roster that they have, where they already have 4 or 5 guys that are scoring at over a point per game, and it's the usual suspects, this is again going to be a very hard team to beat and very much deserving of that cup favorite status that they're going into the season with. However, when it comes to having that conversation about who is the favorite at the moment to win the Stanley Cup at the end of the season, you cannot ignore and shouldn't ignore the start to the season of the reigning champions and team that I have in first place, the Vegas Golden Knights, who have already, I think, set a record for the best start to a season following winning the Cup, with a 6-0 start to this point in the year. Now, one of those they did have to take to a shootout to beat the Stars, but the Avalanche, who I have in second place, also had to go to a shootout to get one of their 5 wins, and that was against the worst team in the NHL, in the only winless team, the Sharks. So between those 2 shootouts, obviously the better victory would go to the Golden Knights as far as strength of schedule or strength of opponent. And outside of that, their other 5 wins have been pretty decisive, starting the year off with 3 consecutive 4-1 victories, and following that shootout victory over the Stars with 2 5-3 wins. And in those 6 wins total, there are, just like the Avalanche, 3 teams that made the postseason last year, including the team that Vegas knocked out in the first round on the way to winning the Cup in the Jets. And for the Golden Knights, just like was the case with the other 2 undefeated teams, probably the leading factor in what's gotten them off to this strong undefeated start to the season has been their ability to keep the puck out of their own net. Because just like the Avalanche and Bruins before them, who were second and first respectively in goals against per game, the Golden Knights aren't far behind in fourth, with the only team between them being, of all teams, the Arizona Coyotes. But all 3 of the top undefeated teams make up 3 of the top 4 when it comes to goals against per game. Obviously, a large chunk of that for the Golden Knights has to do with strong starts to the season for both Adin Hill, who took them on that cup run, as well as Logan Thompson. Maybe not as strong as, say, Georgiev, but still very good start to the season for both of their goaltenders. And obviously that bodes pretty well in case, say, one of them were to go down. Meanwhile, at the other end of the ice, they're right there with the Avalanche in a three-way tie for 5th place in the NHL with 4 goals scored per game. And like the Avalanche, they also have 5 players who are on a point per game pace to this point in the season. And again, it's a lot of the guys you would expect, the Mark Stones, Jack Eichels, Shea Theodores of the world. So for the Golden Knights, they're getting the production in the places they'd like to be getting it from and getting the good goaltending at the other end. So a very steady and dominant start to their season, which, again, I could not make any more clear is not something that I'm particularly fond of as a Kraken fan, but it is what it is, and the Golden Knights are very much one of the Cup favorites, if not maybe the Cup favorite at this point. It certainly seems like the West could come down to the Avalanche and Golden Knights, the last 2 winners of the Cup. Anyway, there you have it, my start to the season, 2 weeks in, top 10 power ranking for the NHL. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Is there any on this list you would vehemently disagree with or disagree with whatsoever? Feel free to put your own top 10 down there. Let me know what you might like to see changed up with these videos if I were to keep doing them going into the future. I'm probably not going to be going to a full 32. I don't have the resources, especially time-wise, that say the hockey guy does, so it's just not going to happen. Plus, unlike him, I'm not very good at doing the whole one-take thing, so these take a little longer to put together. Either way, let me know what you think down in the comment section below, and if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. There's also a link to a Patreon down there if you really want to support things here. Until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and for us Kraken fans, let's hope that they can start the long journey towards maybe getting onto one of these lists in a few weeks' time at the earliest.